Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring early science fiction. The Star by H.G. Wells. Advanced Chemistry by Jack G. Huekels. 1,000 Deaths by Jack London. The Great Keinplatz Experiment by Arthur Conan Doyle. John Jones's Dollar by Harry Stephen Keller. The Star by H.G. Wells. Originally published in Amazing Stories, June 1926. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, that the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheeled about the sun, had become erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to a suspected retardation in its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest the world, the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of the planet Neptune, nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint remote speck of light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough, even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and that the deflection of Neptune and its satellite was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. Few people without training in science can realize the huge isolation of the solar system. The sun, with its specks of planets, its dust of planetoids, and its impalpable comets, swims in vacant immensity that almost defeats the imagination. Beyond the orbit of Neptune there is space, vacant so far as human observation has penetrated, without warmth or light or sound, blank emptiness for 20 million times a million miles. That is the smallest estimate of the distance to be traversed before the nearest of the stars is attained, and, saving a few comets, more unsubstantial than the thinnest flame, no matter had ever to human knowledge crossed the gulf of space until early in the 20th century this wanderer appeared. A vast mass of matter it was, bulky, heavy, rushing without warning out of the black mystery of the sky into the radiance of the sun. By the second day it was clearly visible to any decent instrument as a speck with a barely sensible diameter, in the constellation Leo near Regulus. In a little while an opera glass could attain it. On the 3rd day of the new year, the newspaper readers of 2 hemispheres were made aware for the first time of the real importance of this unusual apparition in the heavens. "A planetary collision," one London paper headed the news, and proclaimed Duchine's opinion that this strange new planet would probably collide with Neptune. The leader writers enlarged upon the topic, so that in most of the capitals of the world, on January 3rd, there was an expectation, however vague, of some eminent phenomenon in the sky, and as the night followed the sunset round the globe, thousands of men turned their eyes skyward to see the old familiar stars just as they had always been. Until it was dawn in London, and Pollux setting, and the stars overhead grown pale. The winter's dawn it was, a sickly filtering accumulation of daylight, and the light of gas in candles shone yellow in the windows to show where people were astir. But the yawning policemen saw the thing. The busy crowds in the market stopped agape, workmen going to their work betimes, milkmen, the drivers of news carts, dissipation going home jaded and pale, homeless wanderers, sentinels on their beats, and in the country, labourers trudging afield, poachers slinking home. All over the dusky, quickening country it would be seen, and out at sea by seamen watching for the day, a great white star come suddenly into the westward sky. Brighter it was than any star in our skies, brighter than the evening star at its brightest. It still glowed out white and large, no mere twinkling spot of light, but a small, round, clear, shining disk, an hour after the day had come. And where science had not reached, men stared and feared, telling one another of the wars and pestilences that are foreshadowed by these fiery signs in the heavens. Sturdy Boers, dusky Hottentots, Gold Coast Negroes, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, stood in the glow of the sunrise watching the setting of this strange new star. And in 100 observatories there had been suppressed excitement, rising almost to shouting pitch, as the two remote bodies had rushed together. There had been a hurrying to and fro to gather photographic apparatus and spectroscope, to gather this appliance and that, to record the novel, astonishing sight, the destruction of a world, for it was a world, a sister planet of our Earth, far greater than our Earth indeed, that had so suddenly flashed into flaming death. Neptune it was which had been struck, fairly and squarely, by the planet from outer space, and the heat of concussion had incontinently turned two solid globes into one vast mass of incandescence. Round the world that day, 2 hours before the dawn, went the pallid great white star, fading only as it sank westward and the sun mounted above it. Everywhere man marvelled at it, but of all those who saw it, none could have marvelled more than those sailors, habitual watchers of the stars, whose far away at sea had heard nothing of its advent, and saw it now rise like a pygmy moon, and climb zenithward, and hang overhead, and sink westward with the passing of the night. And when next it rose over Europe, everywhere were crowds of watchers on hilly slopes, on house roofs, in open spaces, staring eastward, waiting for the rising of the new star. It rose with a white glow in front, like the glare of a white fire, and those who had seen it come into existence the night before cried out at the sight of it. "It's larger," they cried, "it is brighter!" And indeed, the moon, a quarter full and sinking in the west, was in its apparent size beyond comparison, but scarcely in all its breadth had it as much brightness now as the little circle of the strange new star. "It is brighter!" cried the people clustering in the streets. But in the dim observatories the watchers held their breath and peered at one another. "It is nearer," they said, "nearer!" And voice after voice repeated, "It is nearer!" And the clicking telegraph took that up, and it trembled along telephone wires, and in 1,000 cities grimy compositors fingered the type. "It is nearer." Men writing in offices, struck with strange realization, flung down their pens. Men talking in 1,000 places suddenly came upon a grotesque possibility in those words. "It is nearer." It hurried along awakening streets. It was shouted down the frost-stilled ways of quiet villages. Men who had read these things from the throbbing tape stood in yellow-lit doorways shouting the news to the passers-by. "It is nearer." Pretty women, flushed and glittering, heard the news told jestingly between dances, and feigned an intelligent interest they did not feel. "Nearer! Indeed, how curious! How clever people must be to find out things like that!" Lonely tramps faring through the wintry night murmured those words to comfort themselves, looking skyward. "It has need to be nearer, for the night's as cold as charity. Don't see much warmth from it if it's nearer all the same." "What is a new star to me?" cried the weeping woman kneeling beside her dead. The schoolboy, rising early for his examination work, puzzled it out for himself, with a great white star shining broad and bright through the frost flowers of his window. "Centrifugal, centripetal," he said, with his chin on his fist. "Stop a planet in its flight, rob it of its centrifugal force. What then? Centripetal has it, and down it falls into the sun. And this? Do we come in the way? I wonder." The light of that day went the way of its brethren, and with the later watchers of the frosty darkness rose the strange star again, and was now so bright that the waxing moon seemed but a pale yellow ghost of itself, rising huge in the sunset hour. In a South African city a great man had married, and the streets were alight to welcome his return with his bride. "Even the skies have illuminated," said the flatterer. "Under Capricorn, Two Negro lovers, daring the wild beasts and evil spirits for love of one another, crouched together in a canebrake where the fireflies hovered. "That is our star," they whispered, and felt strangely comforted by the sweet brilliancy of its light. The master mathematician sat in his private room and pushed the papers from him. His calculations were already finished. In a small white phial there still remained a little of the drug that had kept him awake and active for 4 long nights. Each day, serene, explicit, patient as ever, he had given his lecture to his students, and then had come back at once for his momentous calculation. His face was grave, a little drawn, and hectic from his drugged activity. For some time he seemed lost in thought. Then he went to the window, and the blind went up with a click. Halfway up the sky, over the clustering roofs, chimneys, and steeples of the city, hung the star. He looked at it as one might look into the eyes of a brave enemy. "You may kill me," he said after a silence, "but I can hold you, and all the universe for that matter, in the grip of this little brain. I would not change even now." He looked at the little phial. "There will be no need to sleep again," he said. The next day at noon, punctual to the minute, he entered his lecture theatre, put his hat on the end of the table as his habit was, and carefully selected a large piece of chalk. It was a joke among his students that he could not lecture without that piece of chalk to fumble in his fingers, and once he had been stricken to impotence by their hiding his supply. He came and looked under his grey eyebrows at the rising tiers of young fresh faces, and spoke with his accustomed studied commonness of phrasing. "Circumstances have arisen, circumstances beyond my control," he said, and paused, "which will debar me from completing the course I had designed. It would seem, gentlemen, if I may put the thing clearly and briefly, that man has lived in vain." The students glanced at one another. Had they heard right? Mad? Raised eyebrows and grinning lips there were, but 1 or 2 faces remained intent upon his calm grey-fringed face. "It will be interesting," he was saying, "to devote this morning to an exposition, so far as I can make it clear to you, of the calculations that had led me to this conclusion. Let us assume—" He turned toward the blackboard, meditating a diagram in the way that was usual to him. "What was that about lived in vain?" whispered one student to another. "Listen," said the other, nodding toward the lecturer. And presently they began to understand. That night the star rose later, for its proper eastward motion had carried it some way across Leo toward Virgo, and its brightness was so great that the sky became a luminous blue as it rose, and every star and planet was hidden, save only Jupiter near the zenith, Capella, Aldebaran, Sirius, and the pointers of the Bear. It was white and beautiful. In many parts of the world that night a pallid halo encircled it about. It was perceptibly larger. In the clear refractive sky of the tropics it seemed as if it were nearly a quarter of the size of the moon. The frost was still on the ground in England, but the world was as brightly lit as if it were midsummer moonlight. One could see to read quite ordinary print by that cold, clear light, and in the cities the lamps burnt yellow and wan. And everywhere the world was awake that night, and throughout Christendom a sombre murmur hung in the keen air of the countryside like the buzzing of the bees in the heather, and this murmurous tumult grew to a clangor in the cities. It was the tolling of the bells in 1,000,000 belfry towers and steeples, summoning the people to sleep no more, to sin no more, but to gather in their churches and pray. And overhead, growing larger and brighter, as the earth rolled on its way and the night passed, rose the dazzling star. And the streets and houses were alight in all the cities, the ship's yard glared, and whatever roads led to high country were lit and crowded all night long. And in all the seas about the civilized lands, ships with throbbing engines and ships with bellying sails, crowded with men and living creatures, were standing out to ocean and to the north. For already the warning of the master mathematician had been telegraphed over the world, and translated into 100 tongues. The new planet and Neptune, locked in a fiery embrace, were whirling headlong, ever faster and faster toward the sun. Already every second this blazing mass flew 100 miles, and every second its terrific velocity increased. As it flew its course, it must pass 100 million of miles wide of the earth and scarcely affect it. But near its destined path, as yet only slightly perturbed, spun the mighty planet Jupiter, and its moons sweeping splendid around the sun. Every moment now the attraction between the fiery star and the greatest of the planets grew stronger. And the result of that attraction? Inevitably Jupiter would be deflected from its orbit to a new elliptical path, and the burning star, swung by his attraction wide of its sunward rush, would describe a curved path, and perhaps collide with, and certainly pass close to, our Earth. Earthquakes, volcanic outbreaks, cyclones, sea waves, floods, and a steady rise in temperature to I know not what limit, so prophesied the master mathematician. And overhead, to carry out his words, lonely and cold and livid, blazed the star of the coming doom. To many who stared at it that night until their eyes ached, it seemed that it was visibly approaching, and that night too the weather changed, and the frost that had gripped all Central Europe and France and England softened towards a thaw. But you must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night, and people going aboard ships, and people fleeing towards mountainous country, that the whole world was already in a terror because of the star. As a matter of fact, use and want still ruled the world, and save for the talk of idle moments and the splendour of the night, 9 human beings out of 10 were still busy at their common occupations. In all the cities the shops, save one here and there, opened and closed at their proper hours. The doctor and the undertaker plied their trades, and workers gathered in the factories, soldiers drilled, scholars studied, lovers sought one another, thieves lurked and fled, politicians planned their schemes. The presses of the newspapers roared through the nights, and many a priest of this church and that would not open his holy building to further what he considered a foolish panic. The newspapers insisted on the lesson of the year 1000, for then, too, people had anticipated the end. The star was no star, mere gas, a comet, and were it a star it would not possibly strike the earth. There was no precedent for such a thing. Common sense was sturdy everywhere, scornful, jesting, a little inclined to persecute the obdurate fearful. That night, at 7:15 by Greenwich time, the star would be at its nearest to Jupiter. Then the world would see the turn things would take. The master mathematician's grim warnings were treated by many as so much mere elaborate self-advertisement. Common sense at last, a little heated by argument, signified its unalterable convictions by going to bed. So, too, barbarism and savagery, already tired of the novelty, went about their nightly business, and save for a howling dog here and there, the beast world left the star unheeded. And yet, when at last the watchers in the European states saw their star rise, an hour later, it is true, but no larger than it had been the night before, there was still plenty awake to laugh at the master mathematician, to take the danger as if it had passed. But hereafter the laughter ceased. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, the brighter and brighter until it had turned night into day. Had it come straight to the earth instead of in a curved path, had it lost no velocity to Jupiter, it must have leapt the intervening gulf in a day. But as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come by our planet. The next night it had become a third the size of the moon before it set to English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America nearly the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at, and hot, and a breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength, and in Virginia and Brazil and down the St. Lawrence Valley it shone intermittently through a driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violet lightning, and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba were a thaw and devastating floods, and upon the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon, in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and the bodies of beasts and men, they rose steadily, steadily in the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying population of their valleys. And along the coast of Argentina and up the South Atlantic tides were higher than they had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters in many cases scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities. And so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn, hillsides were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. China was lit glowing white, but over Japan and Java and all the islands of Eastern Asia the great star was a ball of dull red fire because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above were the lava, hot gases and ash, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with the earthquake shocks. Soon the immemorial snows of Tibet and the Himalayas were melting and pouring down by 10 million deepening converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungles were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters around the stems were dark objects that struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And in an ungovernable confusion a multitude of men and women fled down the broad riverways to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter and brighter with a terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the whirling steam rose in ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships. And then came a wonder. It seemed to those who in Europe watched for the rising of the star that the world must have ceased its rotation. In 1,000 open spaces of down and upland, the people who had fled thither from the floods and the falling houses and sliding slopes of hill watched for that rising in vain. Hour followed hour through a terrible suspense, and the star rose not. Once again men set their eyes upon the old constellations they had counted lost to them forever. In England it was hot and clear overhead, though the ground quivered perpetually, but in the tropics Sirius and Capella and Aldebaran showed through a veil of steam, and when at last the great star rose, near 10 hours late, the sun rose close upon it, and in the centre of its white heart was a disk of black. Over Asia the star had begun to fall behind the movement of the sky, and then suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plain of India from the mouth of the Indus to the mouth of the Ganges was a shallow waste of shining water that night, out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills, black with people. Every minaret was a clustering mass of people who fell one by one into the turbid waters as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there swept a shadow across that furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind, and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men looking up, nearly blinded, at the star, and saw that black disk creeping across the light. It was the moon coming between the star and the earth. And even as men cried to God at his respite, out of the east with a strange inexplicable swiftness sprang the sun, and then star, sun, and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was that presently, to the European watchers, star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space, and then slower, and at last came to rest, star and sun merged into one glare of flame at the zenith of the sky. The moon no longer eclipsed the star, but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky. And though those who were still alive regarded it for the most part with that dull stupidity that hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender, there were still men who could perceive the meaning of these sighs. Star and earth had been at their nearest, had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding, swifter and swifter, in the last stage of its headlong journey downward into the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment around the world. All over the earth was such a downpour of rain as men had never seen before, and where the volcanoes flared red against the cloud canopy, there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud-stilted ruins, and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach with all that had floated, and the dead bodies of the men and brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling huge dikes and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and the heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships as had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of once familiar ports. And as the storms subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon, shrunk to a third of its size, took now 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, of the saving of laws and machines, of the strange change that had Iceland and Greenland, the shores of Baffin Bay, so that the sailors coming there presently found them green and gracious, and could scarce believe their eyes, the story does not tell, nor of the movement of mankind, now that the earth was hotter, northward and southward towards the poles of the earth. It concerns itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. The Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, although they are different beings from men, were naturally profoundly interested by these things. They saw them from their own standpoint, of course. Considering the mass and temperature of the missile that was flung through our solar system into the sun, one wrote, "It is astonishing what little damage the earth, which it missed so narrowly, has sustained. All the familiar continental markings and the masses of the seas remain intact, and indeed the only difference seemed to be a shrinkage of the white discoloration, supposed to be frozen water, round either pole, which only shows how small the vastness of human catastrophes may seem at a distance of a few million miles." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Advanced Chemistry by Jack G. Huekels. Originally published in Amazing Stories, March 1927. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Professor Carbonic was diligently at work in his spacious laboratory, analyzing, mixing, and experimenting. He had been employed for more than 15 years in the same pursuit of happiness, in the same house, same laboratory, and attended by the same servant woman who in her long period of service had attained the plumpness and respectability of 290 pounds. Magnesia, called the professor. The servant's name was Maggie Nesia. Professor Carbonic had contracted the title to save time, for in 50 years he had not mounted the heights of greatness. He must work harder and faster, as life is short, and eliminate such shameful waste of time as putting the ghee on Maggie. "Magnesia," the professor repeated. The old woman rolled slowly into the room. "Get rid of these, and bring the one the boy brought today." He handed her a tray containing 3 dead rats, whose brains had been subjected to analysis. "Yes, Mars," answered Magnesia in a tone like citrate. The professor busied himself with a new preparation of zinc oxide and copper sulphate and sal ammoniac, his latest concoction, which was about to be used and, like its predecessors, to be abandoned. Magnesia appeared bringing another rat, dead. The professor made no experiments on live animals. He had hired a boy in the neighborhood to bring him fresh dead rats at 25 cents per head. Taking the tray, he prepared a hypodermic filled with a new preparation. Carefully, he made an incision above the right eye of the carcass through the bone. He lifted the hypodermic, half hopelessly, half expectantly. The old woman watched him, as she had done many times before, with always the same pitiful expression. Pitiful, either for the man himself or for the dead rat. Magnesia seldom expressed her views. Inserting the hypodermic needle and injecting the contents of the syringe, Professor Carbonic stepped back. Professor Carbonic makes a great discovery. Great saints! His voice could have been heard a mile. Slowly, the rat's tail began to point skyward, and as slowly, Magnesia began to turn white. Professor Carbonic stood as paralyzed. The rat trembled and moved his feet. The man of 60 years made one jump with the alacrity of a boy of 16. He grabbed the enlivened animal and held it high above his head as he jumped about the room. Spying the servant, who until now had seemed unable to move, he threw both arms around her, bringing the rat close to her face. Around the laboratory they danced to the tune of the woman's shrieks. The professor held on, and the woman yelled. Up and down spasmodically on the laboratory floor came the 290 pounds with the professor thrown in. Bottles tumbled from the shelves. Furniture was upset. Precious liquids flowed unrestrained and unnoticed. Finally, the professor dropped with exhaustion, and the rat and Magnesia made a dash for freedom. Early in the morning, pedestrians on Arlington Avenue were attracted by a sign in brilliant letters. Professor Carbonic early in the morning betook himself to the nearest hardware store and purchased the tools necessary for his new profession. He was an M.D., and his recently acquired knowledge put him in a position to startle the world. Having procured what he needed, he returned home. Things were developing fast. Magnesia met him at the door and told him that Sally Soda, who was known to the neighborhood as Sal, or Sal Soda generally, had fallen down 2 flights of stairs, and to use her own words was "pretty bad." Sal Soda's mother, in sending for a doctor, had read the elaborate sign of the new enemy of death, and begged that he come to see Sal as soon as he returned. Bidding Magnesia to accompany him, he went to the laboratory and secured his precious preparation. Professor Carbonic and the unwilling Magnesia started out to put new life into little Sal Soda, who lived in the same block. Reaching the house, they met the family physician, then attendant on little Sal. Dr. X. Ray had also read the sign of the professor, and his greeting was very chilly. "How is the child?" asked the professor. "Fatally hurt and can live but an hour." Then he added, "I have done all that can be done." "All that you can do," corrected the professor. With a withering glance, Dr. X. Ray left the room and the house. His reputation was such as to admit of no intrusion. "I am sorry she is not dead. It would be easier to work, and also a more reasonable charge." Giving Magnesia his instruments, he administered a local anesthetic. This done, he selected a brace and bit that he had procured that morning. With these instruments, he bored a small hole into the child's head. Inserting his hypodermic needle, he injected the immortal fluid. Then, cutting the end of a dowel, which he had also procured that morning, he hammered it into the hole until it wedged itself tight. Professor Carbonic seated himself comfortably and awaited the action of his injection, while the plump Magnesia paced, or rather waddled, the floor with a bag of carpenter's tools under her arm. The fluid worked. The child came to and sat up. Sal Soda had regained her pep. "It will be $1.25, Mrs. Soda," apologized the professor. "I have to make that charge, as it is so inconvenient to work on them when they are still alive." Having collected his fee, the Professor and Magnesia departed, amid the ever-rising blessings of the Soda family. At 3:30 p.m., Magnesia sought her employer, who was asleep in the sitting room. "Master Paul, a gentleman to see you." The Professor awoke, and had her send the man in. The man entered hurriedly, hat in hand. "Are you Professor Carbonic?" "I am. What can I do for you?" "Can you—" The man hesitated. "My friend has just been killed in an accident. You couldn't—" He hesitated again. "I know that it is unbelievable," answered the Professor, "but I can." Professor Carbonic for some years had suffered from the effects of a weak heart. His fears on this score had recently been entirely relieved. Now he had the prescription, death no more. The startling discovery and the happenings of the last 24 hours had begun to take effect on him, and he did not wish to make another call until he was feeling better. "I'll go," said the Professor after a period of musing. "My discoveries are for the benefit of the human race. I must not consider myself." He satisfied himself that he had all the tools. He had just sufficient of the preparation for one injection. This, he thought, would be enough. However, he placed in his case 2 vials of different solutions, which were the basis of his discovery. These fluids had but to be mixed, and after the chemical reaction had taken place, the preparation was ready for use. He searched the house for Magnesia, but the old servant had made it certain that she did not intend to act as nurse to dead men on their journey back to life. Reluctantly, he decided to go without her. "How is it possible?" exclaimed the stranger as they climbed into the waiting machine. "I have worked for 15 years before I found the solution," answered the Professor slowly. "I cannot understand on what you could have based a theory for experimenting on something that has been universally accepted as impossible of solution." "With electricity, all is possible, as I have proved." Seeing the sceptical look his companion assumed, he continued, "Electricity is the basis of every motive power we have. It is the base of every formation that we know." The Professor was warming to the subject. "Go on," said the stranger. "I am extremely interested." "Every sort of heat that is known, whether dormant or active, is only one arm of the gigantic force electricity. The most of our knowledge of electricity has been gained through its offspring, magnetism. A body entirely devoid of electricity is a body dead. Magnetism is apparent in many things, including the human race, and its presence in many people is prominent." "But how did this lead to your experiments?" "If magnetism or motive force is the offspring of electricity, the human body must, and does, contain electricity. That we use more electricity than the human body will induce is a fact. It is apparent, therefore, that a certain amount of electricity must be generated within the human body and without aid of any outside forces. Science has known for years that the body's power is brought into action through the brain. The brain is our generator. The little cells and the fluid that separates them have the same action as the liquid of a wet battery. Like a wet battery, this fluid wears out, and we must replace the fluid or the sal ammoniac, or we lose the use of the battery or body. I have discovered what fluid to use that will produce the electricity in the brain cells which the human body is unable to induce." "We are here," said the stranger as he brought the car to a stop at the curb. "You are still a skeptic," noting the voice of the man, "but you shall see shortly." The man led him into the house and introduced him to Mrs. Murray Attic, who conducted him to the room where the deceased Murray Attic was laid. Without a word, the Professor began his preparations. He was ill, and would have preferred to have been at rest in his own comfortable house. He would do the work quickly and get away. Selecting a gimlet, he bored a hole through the skull of the dead man. Inserting his hypodermic, he injected all the fluid he had mixed. He had not calculated on the size of the gimlet, and the dowels he carried would not fit the hole. As a last resource, he drove in his lead pencil, broke it off close, and carefully cut the splinters smooth with the head. "It will be 75 cents, madam," said the professor as he finished the work. Mrs. Murray Attic paid the money unconsciously. She did not know whether he was embalming her husband or just trying the keenness of his new tools. The death had been too much for her. The minutes passed, and still the dead man showed no signs of reviving. Professor Carbonic paced the floor in an agitated manner. He began to be doubtful of his ability to bring the man back. Worried, he continued his tramp up and down the room. His heart was affecting him. He was tempted to return the 75 cents to the prostrate wife when the dead man moved. The professor clasped his hand to his throat, and with his head thrown back dropped to the floor. A fatal attack of the heart. He became conscious quickly. "The bottle's there," he whispered. "Mix. Make injection." He became unconscious again. The stranger found the gimlet and bored a hole in the professor's head. Hastily seizing one of the vials, he poured the contents into the deeply made hole. He then realized that there was another bottle. "Mix them!" shrieked the almost hysterical woman. It was too late. The one vial was empty, and the professor's body lay lifeless. In mental agony, the stranger grasped the second vial and emptied its contents also into the professor's head, and stopped the hole with the cork. Miraculously, Professor Carbonic opened his eyes and rose to his feet. His eyes were like balls of fire. His lips moved inaudibly, and as they moved, little blue sparks were seen to pass from one to another. His hair stood out from his head. The chemical reaction was going on in the professor's brain, with a dose powerful enough to restore 10 men. He tottered slightly. Murray Attic, now thoroughly alive, sat up straight in bed. He grasped the brass bedpost with one hand and stretched out the other to aid the staggering man. He caught his hand. Both bodies stiffened. A slight crackling sound was audible. A blue flash shot from where Attic's had made contact with the bedpost, then a dull thud as both bodies struck the floor. Both men were electrocuted, and the formula is still a secret. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. 1,000 Deaths by Jack London. Originally published in Black Cat magazine, May 1899. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I had been in the water about an hour, and cold, exhausted, with a terrible cramp in my right calf. It seemed as though my hour had come. Fruitlessly struggling against the strong ebb tide, I had beheld the maddening procession of the waterfront lights slip by, but now I gave up attempting to breast the stream and contented myself with the bitter thoughts of a wasted career now drawing to a close. It had been my luck to come of good English stock, but of parents whose account with the bankers far exceeded their knowledge of child nature and the rearing of children. While born with a silver spoon in my mouth, the blessed atmosphere of my home circle was to me unknown. My father, a very learned man and a celebrated antiquarian, gave no thought to his family, being constantly lost in the abstractions of his study, while my mother, noted far more for her good looks than her good sense, sated herself with the adulation of the society in which she was perpetually plunged. I went through the regular school and college routine of a boy of the English bourgeoisie, and as the years brought me increasing strength and passions, my parents suddenly became aware that I was possessed of an immortal soul, and endeavoured to draw the curb. But it was too late. I perpetrated the wildest and most audacious folly, and was disowned by my people. ostracized by the society I had so long outraged, and with the £1,000 my father gave me, with a declaration that he should neither see me again nor give me more, I took a first-class passage to Australia. Since then, my life had been one long peregrination, from the Orient to the Occident, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, to find myself at last, an able seaman at 30, in the full vigour of my manhood, drowning in San Francisco Bay because of a disastrously successful attempt to desert my ship. My right leg was drawn up by the cramp, and I was suffering the keenest agony. A slight breeze stirred up a choppy sea, which washed into my mouth and down my throat, nor could I prevent it. Though I still contrived to keep afloat, it was merely mechanical, for I was rapidly becoming unconscious. I have a dim recollection of drifting past the sea-wall, and of catching a glimpse of an upriver steamer's starboard light. Then everything became a blank. I heard the low hum of insect life, and felt the balmy air of a spring morning fanning my cheek. Gradually it assumed a rhythmic flow, to whose soft pulsations my body seemed to respond. I floated on the gentle bosom of a summer's sea, rising and falling with dreamy pleasure on each crooning wave. But the pulsations grew stronger, the humming louder, the waves larger, fiercer. I was dashed about on a stormy sea. A great agony fastened upon me. Brilliant, intermittent sparks of light flashed athwart my inner consciousness. In my ears there was the sound of many waters. Then a sudden snapping of an intangible something, and I awoke. The scene, of which I was protagonist, was a curious one. A glance sufficed to inform me that I lay on the cabin floor of some gentleman's yacht, in a most uncomfortable posture. On either side, grasping my arms and working them up and down like pump handles, were two peculiarly clad, dark-skinned creatures. Though conversant with most aboriginal types, I could not conjecture their nationality. Some attachment had been fastened about my head, which connected my respiratory organs with a machine I shall next describe. My nostrils, however, had been closed, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. Foreshortened by the obliquity of my line of vision, I beheld two tubes, similar to small hosing, but of different composition, which emerged from my mouth and went off at an acute angle from each other. The first came to an abrupt termination and lay on the floor beside me. The second traversed the floor in numerous coils, connecting with the apparatus I have promised to describe. In the days before my life had become tangential, I had dabbled not a little in science, and, conversant with the appurtenances and general paraphernalia of the laboratory, I appreciated the machine I now beheld. It was composed chiefly of glass, the construction being of that crude sort which is employed for experimentative purposes. A vessel of water was surrounded by an air chamber, to which was fixed a vertical tube surmounted by a globe. In the centre of this was a vacuum gauge. The water in the tube moved upwards and downwards, creating alternate inhalations and exhalations, which were in turn communicated to me through the hose. With this, and the aid of the men who pumped my arms so vigorously, had the process of breathing been artificially carried on, my chest rising and falling, and my lungs expanding and contracting, till nature could be persuaded to again take up her wonted labour. As I opened my eyes, the appliance about my head, nostrils, and mouth was removed. Draining a stiff 3 fingers of brandy, I staggered to my feet to thank my preserver, and confronted my father. But long years of fellowship with danger had taught me self-control, and I waited to see if he would recognize me. Not so. he saw in me no more than a runaway sailor, and treated me accordingly. Leaving me to the care of the blackies, he fell to revising the notes he had made on my resuscitation. As I ate of the handsome fare served up to me, confusion began on deck, and from the chanties of the sailors and the rattling of blocks and tackles, I surmised that we were getting under way. What a lark! Off on a cruise with my recluse father into the wide Pacific! Little did I realize, as I laughed to myself, which side the joke was to be on. Had I known, I would have plunged overboard and welcomed the dirty forecastle from which I had just escaped. I was not allowed on deck till we had sunk the Farallones and the last pilot boat. I appreciated this forethought on the part of my father, and made it a point to thank him heartily in my bluff seaman's manner. I could not suspect that he had his own ends in view, in thus keeping my presence secret to all save the crew. He told me briefly of my rescue by his sailors, assuring me that the obligation was on his side, as my appearance had been most opportune. He had constructed the apparatus for the vindication of a theory concerning certain biological phenomena, and had been waiting for an opportunity to use it. "You have proved it beyond all doubt," he said, then added with a sigh, "but only in the small matter of drowning." But, to take a reef in my yarn, he offered me an advance of £2 on my previous wages to sail with him, and this I considered handsome, for he really did not need me. Contrary to my expectations, I did not join the sailor mess, for'ard, being assigned to a comfortable stateroom and eating at the captain's table. He had perceived that I was no common sailor, and I resolved to take this chance for reinstating myself in his good graces. I wove a fictitious past to account for my education and present position, and did my best to come in touch with him. I was not long in disclosing a predilection for scientific pursuits, nor he in appreciating my aptitude. I became his assistant, with a corresponding increase in wages, and before long, as he grew confidential and expounded his theories, I was as enthusiastic as himself. The days flew quickly by, for I was deeply interested in my new studies, passing my waking hours in his well-stocked library, or listening to his plans and aiding him in his laboratory work. But we were forced to forego many enticing experiments, a rolling ship not being exactly the proper place for delicate or intricate work. He promised me, however, many delightful hours in the magnificent laboratory for which we were bound. He had taken possession of an uncharted South Sea island, as he said, and turned it into a scientific paradise. We had not been on the island long before I discovered the horrible mare's nest I had fallen into. But before I describe the strange things which came to pass, I must briefly outline the causes which culminated in as startling an experience as ever fell to the lot of man. Late in life, my father had abandoned the musty charms of antiquity and succumbed to the more fascinating ones embraced under the general head of biology. Having been thoroughly grounded during his youth in the fundamentals, he rapidly explored all the higher branches as far as the scientific world had gone, and found himself on the no-man's land of the unknowable. It was his intention to preempt some of this unclaimed territory, and it was at this stage of investigations that we had been thrown together. Having a good brain, though I say it myself, I had mastered his speculations and methods of reasoning, becoming almost as mad as himself. But I should not say this. The marvelous results we afterwards obtained can only go to prove his sanity. I can but say that he was the most abnormal specimen of cold-blooded cruelty I have ever seen. After having penetrated the dual mysteries of physiology and psychology, his thought had led him to the verge of a great field for which, the better to explore, he began studies in higher organic chemistry, pathology, toxicology, and other sciences and sub-sciences rendered kindred as accessories to his speculative hypotheses, starting from the proposition that a direct cause of the temporary and permanent arrest of vitality was due to the coagulation of certain elements and compounds in the protoplasm. He had isolated and subjected these various substances to innumerable experiments. Since the temporary arrest of vitality in an organism brought coma, and a permanent arrest, death, he held that by artificial means this coagulation of the protoplasm could be retarded, prevented, and even overcome in the extreme states of solidification. Or, to do away with the technical nomenclature, he argued that death, when not violent and in which none of the organs had suffered injury, was merely suspended vitality, and that, in such instances, life could be induced to resume its functions by the use of proper methods. This, then, was his idea: to discover the method, and by practical experimentation prove the possibility of renewing vitality in a structure from which life had seemingly fled. Of course, he recognized the futility of such endeavor after decomposition had set in. He must have organisms which but the moment, the hour, or the day before had been quick with life. With me, in a crude way, he had proved this theory. I was really drowned, really dead, when picked from the water of San Francisco Bay, but the vital spark had been renewed by means of his aerotherapeutical apparatus, as he called it. Now to his dark purpose concerning me. He first showed me how completely I was in his power. He had sent the yacht away for a year, retaining only his 2 blackies, who were utterly devoted to him. He then made an exhaustive review of his theory and outlined the method of proof he had adopted, concluding with the startling announcement that I was to be his subject. I had faced death and weighed my chances in many a desperate venture, but never in one of this nature. I can swear I am no coward, yet this proposition of journeying back and forth across the borderland of death put the yellow fear upon me. I asked for time, which he granted, at the same time assuring me that but the one course was open. I must submit. Escape from the island was out of the question. Escape by suicide was not to be entertained, though really preferable to what it seemed I must undergo. My only hope was to destroy my captors, but this latter was frustrated through the precautions taken by my father. I was subjected to a constant surveillance, even in my sleep being guarded by one or the other of the blacks. Having pleaded in vain, I announced and proved that I was his son. It was my last card, and I had played all my hopes upon it. But he was inexorable. He was not a father, but a scientific machine. I wonder yet how it ever came to pass that he married my mother or begat me, for there was not the slightest grain of emotion in his make-up. Reason was all in all to him, nor could he understand such things as love or sympathy in others, except as petty weaknesses which should be overcome. So he informed me that in the beginning he had given me life, and who had better right to take it away than he? Such, he said, was not his desire. However, he merely wished to borrow it occasionally, promising to return it punctually at the appointed time. Of course, there was a liability of mishaps, but I could do no more than take the chances, since the affairs of men were full of such. The better to ensure success, he wished me to be in the best possible condition, so I was dieted and trained like a great athlete before a decisive contest. What could I do? If I had to undergo the peril, it were best to be in good shape.
In my intervals of relaxation, he allowed me to assist in the arranging of the apparatus and in the various subsidiary experiments. The interest I took in all such operations can be imagined. I mastered the work as thoroughly as he, and often had the pleasure of seeing some of my suggestions or alterations put into effect. After such events, I would smile grimly, conscious of officiating at my own funeral. He began by inaugurating a series of experiments in toxicology. When all was ready, I was killed by a stiff dope of strychnine and allowed to lie dead for some 20 hours. During that period, my body was dead, absolutely dead. All respiration and circulation ceased. But the frightful part of it was that while the protoplasmic coagulation proceeded, I retained consciousness and was enabled to study it in all its ghastly details. The apparatus to bring me back to life was an airtight chamber fitted to receive my body. The mechanism was simple: a few valves, a rotary shaft and crank, and an electric motor. When in operation, the interior atmosphere was alternately condenses and rarefied, thus communicating to my lungs an artificial respiration without the agency of the hosing previously used. Though my body was inert, and for all I knew in the first stages of decomposition, I was cognizant of everything that transpired. I knew when they placed me in the chamber, and thought all my senses were quiescent. I was aware of hypodermic injections of a compound to react upon the coagulatory process. Then the chamber was closed, and the machinery started. My anxiety was terrible, but in the circulation became gradually restored. The different organs began to carry on their respective functions, and in an hour's time I was eating a hearty dinner. It cannot be said that I participated in this series, nor in the subsequent ones, with much verve, but after 2 ineffectual attempts of escape, I began to take quite an interest. Besides, I was becoming accustomed. My father was beside himself at his success, and as the months rolled by, his speculations took wilder and yet wilder flights. We ranged through the 3 great classes of poisons, the neurotics, the gaseous, and the irritants, but carefully avoided some of the mineral irritants and passed the whole group of corrosives. During the poison regime, I became quite accustomed to dying, and had but one mishap to shake my growing confidence. Scarifying a number of lesser blood vessels in my arm, he introduced a minute quantity of that most frightful of poisons, the arrow poison, or curare. I lost consciousness at the start, quickly followed by the cessation of respiration and circulation, and so far had the solidification of the protoplasm advanced that he gave up all hope. But at the last moment he applied a discovery he had been working upon, receiving such encouragement as to redouble his efforts. In a glass vacuum, similar but not exactly like a Crookes tube, was placed a magnetic field. When penetrated by polarized light, it gave no phenomena of phosphorescence nor the rectilinear projection of atoms, but emitted non-luminous rays similar to the X-ray. While the X-ray could reveal opaque objects hidden in dense mediums, this was possessed of far subtler penetration. By this he photographed my body, and found on the negative an infinite number of blurred shadows due to the chemical and electric motions still going on. This was an infallible proof that the rigor mortis in which I lay was not genuine, that is, those mysterious forces, those delicate bonds which held my soul to my body, were still in action. The resultants of all other poisons were unapparent, save those of mercurial compounds, which usually left me languid for several days. Another series of delightful experiments was with electricity. We verified Tesla's assertion that high currents were utterly harmless by passing 100,000 volts through my body. As this did not affect me, the current was reduced to 2,500, and I was quickly electrocuted. This time he ventured so far as to allow me to remain dead, or in a state of suspended vitality, for 3 days. It took 4 hours to bring me back. Once he superinduced lockjaw, but the agony of dying was so great that I positively refused to undergo similar experiments. The easiest deaths were by asphyxiation, such as drowning, strangling, and suffocation by gas, while those by morphine, opium, cocaine, and chloroform were not at all hard. Another time, after being suffocated, he kept me in cold storage for 3 months, not permitting me to freeze or decay. This was without my knowledge, and I was in a great fright on discovering the lapse of time. I became afraid of what he might do with me when I lay dead, my alarm being increased by the predilection he was beginning to betray towards vivisection. The last time I was resurrected, I discovered that he had been tampering with my breast. Though he had carefully dressed and sewed the incisions up, they were so severe that I had to take to my bed for some time. It was during this convalescence that I evolved the plan by which I ultimately escaped. While feigning unbounded enthusiasm in the work, I asked and received a vacation from my moribund occupation. During this period, I devoted myself to laboratory work, while he was too deep in the vivisection of the many animals captured by the blacks to take notice of my work. It was on these 2 propositions that I constructed my theory. First, electrolysis, or the decomposition of water into its constituent gases by means of electricity, and second, by the hypothetical existence of a force, the converse of gravitation, which Astor has named apogee. Terrestrial attraction, for instance, merely draws objects together, but does not combine them. Hence, apogee is merely repulsion. Now, atomic or molecular attraction not only draws objects together, but integrates them, and it was the converse of this, or a disintegrative force, which I wished to not only discover and produce, but to direct at will. Thus, the molecules of hydrogen and oxygen reacting on each other separate and create new molecules containing both elements and forming water. Electrolysis causes these molecules to split up and resume their original condition, producing the 2 gases separately. The force I wish to find must not only do this with 2, but with all elements, no matter in what compounds they exist. If I could then entice my father within its radius, he would be instantly disintegrated and sent flying to the 4 quarters, a mass of isolated elements. It must not be understood that this force, which I finally came to control, annihilated matter. It merely annihilated form. Nor, as I soon discovered, had it any effect on inorganic structure, but to all organic form it was absolutely fatal. This partially puzzled me at first. Though I had stopped to think deeper, I would have seen through it. Since the number of atoms in organic molecules is far greater than in the most complex mineral molecules, organic compounds are characterized by their instability and the ease with which they are split up by physical forces and chemical reagents. By 2 powerful batteries, connected with magnets constructed specially for this purpose, 2 tremendous forces were projected. Considered apart from each other, they were perfectly harmless, but they accomplished their purpose by focusing at an invisible point in mid-air. After practically demonstrating its success, besides narrowly escaping being blown into nothingness, I laid my trap, concealing the magnets so that their force made the whole space of my chamber doorway a field of death, and placing by my couch a button by which I could throw on the current from the storage batteries, I climbed into bed. The blackie still guarded my sleeping quarters, one relieving the other at midnight. I turned on the current as soon as the first man arrived. Hardly had I begun to doze when I was aroused by a sharp metallic tinkle. There, on the mid-threshold, lay the collar of Dan, my father's St. Bernard. My keeper ran to pick it up. He disappeared like a gust of wind, his clothes falling to the floor in a heap. There was a slight whiff of ozone in the air, but since the principal gaseous components of his body were hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which are equally colourless and odourless, there was no other manifestation of his departure. Yet, when I shut off the current and removed the garments, I found a deposit of carbon in the form of animal charcoal, also other powders, the isolated solid elements of his organism, such as sulphur, potassium, and iron. Resetting the trap, I crawled back to bed. At midnight, I got up and removed the remains of the second black, and then slept peacefully till morning. I was awakened by the strident voice of my father, who was calling to me from across the laboratory. I laughed to myself. There had been no one to call him, and he had overslept. I could hear him as he approached my room with the intention of rousing me, and so I sat up in bed, the better to observe his translation. Perhaps apotheosis were a better term. He paused a moment at the threshold, then took the fatal step. Puff! It was like the wind sighing among the pines. He was gone. His clothes fell in a fantastic heap on the floor. Besides ozone, I noticed the faint garlic-like odour of phosphorus. A little pile of elementary solids lay among his garments. That was all. The wide world lay before me. My captors were no more.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Great Keinplatz Experiment by Arthur Conan Doyle. Originally published in Belgravia, July 1885. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Of all the sciences which have puzzled the sons of men, none have had such an attraction for the learned Professor von Baumgarten as those which relate to psychology and the ill-defined relations between mind and matter. A celebrated anatomist, a profound chemist, and one of the first physiologists in Europe, it was a relief for him to turn from these subjects and to bring his varied knowledge to bear upon the study of the soul and the mysterious relationship of spirits. At first, when as a young man he began to dip into the secrets of mesmerism, his mind seemed to be wandering in a strange land where all was chaos and darkness, save that here and there some great unexplainable and disconnected fact loomed out in front of him. As the years passed, however, and as the worthy professor's stock of knowledge increased, for knowledge begets knowledge, as money bears interest, much which had seemed strange and unaccountable began to take another shape in his eyes. New trains of reasoning became familiar to him, and he perceived connecting links where all had been incomprehensible and startling. By experiments which extended over 20 years, he obtained a basis of facts upon which it was his ambition to build up a new exact science, which should embrace mesmerism, spiritualism, and all cognate subjects. In this he was much helped by his intimate knowledge of the more intricate parts of animal physiology, which treat of nerve currents and the working of the brain. For Alexis von Baumgarten was Regius Professor of Physiology at the University of Keinplatz, and had all the resources of the laboratory to aid him in his profound researches. Professor von Baumgarten was tall and thin, with a hatchet face and steel-grey eyes which were singularly bright and penetrating. Much thought had furrowed his forehead and contracted his heavy eyebrows, so that he appeared to wear a perpetual frown, which often misled people as to his character, for though austere, he was tender-hearted. He was popular among the students, who would gather round him after his lectures and listen eagerly to his strange theories. Often he would call for volunteers from amongst them in order to conduct some experiment, so that eventually there was hardly a lad in the class who had not, at some time or other, been thrown into a mesmeric trance by his professor. Of all these young devotees of science, there was none who equalled in enthusiasm Fritz von Hartmann. It had often seemed strange to his fellow students that wild, reckless Fritz, as dashing a young fellow as ever hailed from the Rhinelands, should devote the time and trouble which he did in reading up abstruse works and in assisting the professor in his strange experiments. The fact was, however, that Fritz was a knowing and long-headed fellow. Months before he had lost his heart to young Elisa, the blue-eyed, yellow-haired daughter of the lecturer. Although he had succeeded in learning from her lips that she was not indifferent to his suit, he had never dared to announce himself to her family as a formal suitor. Hence he would have found it a difficult matter to see his young lady had he not adopted the expedient of making himself useful to the professor. By this means he frequently was asked to the old man's house, where he willingly submitted to be experimented upon in any way, as long as there was a chance of his receiving one bright glance from the eyes of Elisa, or one touch of her little hand. Young Fritz von Hartmann was a handsome lad enough. There were broad acres, too, which would descend to him when his father died. To many he would have seemed an eligible suitor, but Madame frowned upon his presence in the house, and lectured the professor at times on his allowing such a wolf to prowl around their lamb. To tell the truth, Fritz had an evil name in Keinplatz. Never was there a riot or a duel or any other mischief afoot, but the young Rhinelander figured as a ringleader in it. No one used more free and violent language. No one drank more. No one played cards more habitually. No one was more idle, save in the one solitary subject. No wonder, then, that the good Frau Professorin gathered her Fraulein under her wing, and resented the attentions of such a mauvais sujet. As to the worthy lecturer, he was too much engrossed by his strange studies to form an opinion upon the subject one way or the other. For many years there was one question which had continually obtruded himself upon his thoughts. All his experiments and his theories turned upon a single point. 100 times a day the professor asked himself whether it was possible for the human spirit to exist apart from the body for a time, and then to return to it once again. When the possibility first suggested itself to him, his scientific mind had revolted from it. It clashed too violently with preconceived ideas and the prejudices of his early training. Gradually, however, as he proceeded farther and farther along the pathway of original research, his mind shook off its old fetters and became ready to face any conclusion which could reconcile the facts. There were many things which made him believe that it was possible for mind to exist apart from matter. At last it occurred to him that by a daring and original experiment the question might be definitely decided. "It is evident," he remarked in his celebrated article upon the visible entities, which appeared in the Keinplatz Wochentliche Medikalschrift about this time, and which surprised the whole scientific world. It is evident that under certain conditions the soul or mind does separate itself from the body. In the case of a mesmerized person, the body lies in a cataleptic condition, but the spirit has left it. Perhaps you reply that the soul is there, but in a dormant condition. I answer that this is not so. Otherwise, how can one account for the condition of clairvoyance, which has fallen into disrepute through the knavery of certain scoundrels, but which can easily be shown to be an undoubted fact? I have been able myself, with a sensitive subject, to obtain an accurate description of what was going on in another room or another house. How can such knowledge be accounted for on any hypothesis, save that the soul of the subject has left the body and is wandering through space? For a moment it is recalled by the voice of the operator and says what it has seen, and then wings its way once more through the air. Since the spirit is by its very nature invisible, we cannot see these comings and goings, but we see their effect in the body of the subject, now rigid and inert, now struggling to narrate impressions which could never have come to it by natural means. There is only one way which I can see by which the fact can be demonstrated. Although we in flesh are unable to see these spirits, yet our own spirits, could we separate them from the body, would be conscious of the presence of others. It is my intention, therefore, shortly to mesmerize one of my pupils. I can then mesmerize myself in a manner which has become easy to me. After that, if my theory holds good, my spirit will have no difficulty in meeting and communing with the spirit of my pupil, both being separated from the body. I hope to be able to communicate the result of this interesting experiment in an early number of the Keinplatz wöchentliche Medikalschrift. When the good professor finally fulfilled his promise and published an account of what occurred, the narrative was so extraordinary that it was received with general incredulity. The tone of some of the papers was so offensive in their comments upon the matter that the angry savant declared that he would never open his mouth again, or refer to the subject in any way, a promise which he has faithfully kept. This narrative have been compiled, however, from the most authentic sources, and the events cited in it may be relied upon as substantially correct. It happened, then, that shortly after the time when Professor von Baumgarten conceived the idea of the above-mentioned experiment, he was walking thoughtfully homewards after a long day in the laboratory, when he met a crowd of roistering students who had just streamed out from a beer-house. At the head of them, half intoxicated and very noisy, was young Fritz von Hartmann. The professor would have passed them, but his pupil ran across and intercepted him. "Hey, my worthy master," he said, taking the old man by the sleeve and leading him down the road with him. "There is something that I have to say to you, and it is easier for me to say it now, when the good beer is humming in my head, than at another time." "What is it then, Fritz?" the physiologist asked, looking at him in mild surprise. "I hear, mein Herr, that you are about to do some wondrous experiment in which you hope to take a man's soul out of his body, and then to put it back again. Is it not so?" "It is true, Fritz." "And have you considered, my dear sir, that you may have some difficulty in finding someone on whom to try this? Potztausend! Suppose that the soul went out and could not come back. That would be a bad business. Who is to take the risk?" "But, Fritz," the professor cried, very much startled by this view of the matter, "I had relied upon your assistance in the attempt. Surely you will not desert me. Consider the honor and glory." "Consider the fiddlesticks!" the student cried angrily. "Am I to be paid always thus? Did I not stand 2 hours upon a glass insulator while you poured electricity into my body? Have you not stimulated my phrenic nerves, besides ruining my digestion with a galvanic current around my stomach? 34 times you have mesmerized me, and what have I got from all this? Nothing. And now you wish to take my soul out, as you would take the works from a watch? It is more than flesh and blood can stand." "Dear, dear," the professor cried in great distress, "that is very true. Fritz, I have never thought of it before. If you can but suggest how I can compensate you, you will find me ready and willing." "Then listen," said Fritz solemnly. "If you will pledge your word that after this experiment I may have the hand of your daughter, then I am willing to assist you. But if not, I shall have nothing to do with it. Those are my only terms." "And what would my daughter say to this?" the professor exclaimed after a pause of astonishment. "Elisa would welcome it," the young man replied. "We have loved each other long." "Then she shall be yours," the physiologist said with decision, "for you are a good-hearted young man, and one of the best neurotic subjects I have ever known. That is, when you are not under the influence of alcohol. My experiment is to be performed upon the 4th of next month. You will attend at the physiological laboratory at 12 o'clock. It will be a great occasion, Fritz. Von Gruben is coming from Jena, and Hinterstein from Basel. The chief men of science of all South Germany will be there." "I shall be punctual," the student said briefly, and so the two parted. The professor plodded homeward, thinking of the great coming event, while the young man staggered along after his noisy companions, with his mind full of the blue-eyed Elisa, and of the bargain which he had concluded with her father. The professor did not exaggerate when he spoke of the widespread interest excited by his novel psychological experiment. Long before the hour had arrived, the room was filled by a galaxy of talent. Besides the celebrities whom he had mentioned, there had come from London the great Professor Lurcher, who had just established his reputation by a remarkable treatise upon cerebral centres. Several great lights of the spiritualistic body had also come a long distance to be present, as had a Swedenborgian minister who considered that the proceedings might throw some light upon the doctrines of the Rosy Cross. There was considerable applause from his eminent assembly upon the appearance of Professor von Baumgarten and his subject upon the platform. The lecturer, in a few well-chosen words, explained what his views were, and how he proposed to test them. "I hold," he said, "that when a person is under the influence of mesmerism, his spirit is for the time released from his body, and I challenge any one to put forward any other hypothesis which will account for the fact of clairvoyance. I therefore hope that upon mesmerizing my young friend here, and then putting myself into a trance, our spirits may be able to commune together, though our bodies lie still and inert. After a time, nature will resume her sway, our spirits will return into our respective bodies, and all will be as before. With your kind permission, we shall now proceed to attempt the experiment." The applause was renewed at this speech, and the audience settled down in expectant silence. With a few rapid passes, the professor mesmerized the young man, who sank back in his chair, pale and rigid. He then took a bright globe of glass from his pocket, and by concentrating his gaze upon it and making a strong mental effort, he succeeded in throwing himself into the same condition. It was a strange and impressive sight to see the old man and the young sitting together in the same cataleptic condition. Whither, then, had their souls fled? That was the question which presented itself to each and every one of the spectators. 5 minutes passed, and then 10, and then 15, and then 15 more, while the professor and his pupil sat stiff and stark upon the platform. During that time, not a sound was heard from the assembled savants, but every eye was bent upon the two pale faces, in search of the first signs of returning consciousness. Nearly an hour had elapsed before the patient watchers were rewarded. A faint flush came back to the cheeks of Professor von Baumgarten. The soul was coming back once more to its earthly tenement. Suddenly he stretched out his long thin arms as one awaking from sleep, and rubbing his eyes, stood up from his chair and gazed about him as though he had hardly realized where he was. "Tausend Teufel!" he exclaimed, rapping out a tremendous South German oath, to the great astonishment of his audience and to the disgust of the Swedenborgian.
Where the henker am I, then, and what in thunder has occurred? Oh, yes, I remember now. One of these nonsensical mesmeric experiments. There is no result this time, for I remember nothing at all since I became unconscious. So you have had all your long journeys for nothing, my learned friends, and a very good joke too." At which the Regius Professor of Physiology burst into a roar of laughter and slapped his thigh in a highly indecorous fashion. The audience was so enraged at this unseemly behaviour on the part of their host that there might have been a considerable disturbance, had it not been for the judicious interference of young Fritz von Hartmann, who had now recovered from his lethargy. Stepping to the front of the platform, the young man apologized for the conduct of his companion. "I am sorry to say," he said, "that he is a harum-scarum sort of fellow, although he appeared so grave at the commencement of this experiment. He is still suffering from mesmeric reaction, and is hardly accountable for his words. As to the experiment itself, I do not consider it to be a failure. It is very possible that our spirits may have been communing in space during this hour, but, unfortunately, our gross bodily memory is distinct from our spirit, and we cannot recall what has occurred. My energies shall now be devoted to devising some means by which spirits may be able to recollect what occurs to them in their free state, and I trust that when I have worked this out, I may have the pleasure of meeting you all once again in this hall and demonstrating to you the result." This address, coming from so young a student, caused considerable astonishment among the audience, and some were inclined to be offended, thinking that he assumed rather too much importance. The majority, however, looked upon him as a young man of great promise, and many comparisons were made as they left the hall between his dignified conduct and the levity of his professor, who during the above remarks was laughing heartily in a corner, by no means abashed at the failure of the experiment. Now, although all these learned men were filing out of the lecture-room under the impression that they had seen nothing of note, as a matter of fact, one of the most wonderful things in the whole history of the world had just occurred before their very eyes. Professor von Baumgarten had been so far correct in his theory that both his spirit and that of his pupil had been for a time absent from the body. But here a strange and unforeseen complication had occurred. In their return, the spirit of Fritz von Hartmann had entered into the body of Alexis von Baumgarten, and that of Alexis von Baumgarten had taken up its abode in the frame of Fritz von Hartmann. Hence the slang and scurrility which issued from the lips of the serious professor, and hence also the weighty words and grave statements which fell from the careless student. It was an unprecedented event, yet no one knew of it, least of all those whom it concerned. The body of the professor, feeling conscious suddenly of a great dryness about the back of the throat, sallied out into the street, still chuckling to himself over the result of the experiment, for the soul of Fritz within was reckless at the thought of the bride whom he had won so easily. His first impulse was to go up to the house and see her, but on second thought he came to the conclusion that it would be best to stay away until Madame Baumgarten should be informed by her husband of the agreement which had been made. He therefore made his way down to the Grinarmann, which was one of the favourite trysting places of the wilder students, and ran, boisterously waving his cane in the air, into the little parlour, where sat Spiegler and Müller and half a dozen other boon companions. "Ha, ha, my boys!" he shouted. "I knew I should find you here. Drink up, every one of you, and call for what you like, for I am going to stand treat today." Had the green man who is depicted upon the signpost of that well-known inn suddenly marched into the room and called for a bottle of wine, the students could not have been more amazed than they were by this unexpected entry of their revered professor. They were so astonished that for a minute or two they glared at him in utter bewilderment without being able to make any reply to his hearty invitation. "Donner und Blitzen!" shouted the professor angrily. "What the deuce is the matter with you, then? You sit there like a set of stuck pigs staring at me. What is it, then?" "It is the unexpected honour," stammered Spiegel, who was in the chair. "Honour! Rubbish!" said the professor testily. "Do you think that just because I happen to have been exhibiting mesmerism to a parcel of old fossils, I am therefore too proud to associate with dear old friends like you? Come out of that chair, Spiegel, my boy, for I shall preside now. Beer, or wine, or schnapps, my lads, call for what you like, and put it all down to me." Never was there such an afternoon in the Grüner Mann. The foaming flagons of lager and the green-necked bottle of Rhenish circulated merrily. By degrees the students lost their shyness in the presence of their professor. As for him, he shouted, he sang, he roared, he balanced a long tobacco pipe upon his nose, and offered to run 100 yards against any member of the company. The Kellner and the barmaid whispered to each other outside the door their astonishment at such proceedings to the part of a Regius Professor of the ancient University of Keinplatz. They had still more to whisper about afterwards, for the learned man cracked the Kellner's crown and kissed the barmaid behind the kitchen door. "Gentlemen," said the Professor, standing up, albeit somewhat totteringly, at the end of the table, and balancing his high old-fashioned wine-glass in his bony hand, "I must now explain to you what is the cause of this festivity." "Hear, hear!" roared the students, hammering their beer-glasses against the table. "A speech! A speech! Silence for a speech!" "The fact is, my friends," said the Professor, beaming through his spectacles, "I hope very soon to be married." "Married!" cried a student, bolder than the others. "Is Madame dead, then?" "Madame who?" "Why, Madame von Baumgarten, of course." "Ha, ha!" laughed the Professor. "I can see, then, that you know all about my former difficulties. No, she is not dead, but I have reason to believe that she will not oppose my marriage." "That is very accommodating of her," remarked one of the company. "In fact," said the Professor, "I hope that she will now be induced to aid me in getting a wife. She and I never took to each other very much, but now I hope all that may be ended, and when I marry she will come and stay with me." "What a happy family!" exclaimed some wag. "Yes, indeed, and I hope you will come to my wedding, all of you. I won't mention names, but here is to my little bride." And the Professor waved his glass in the air. "Here's to his little bride!" roared the roisterers with shouts of laughter. "Here's her health! Sie soll leben! Hoch!" And so the fun waxed still more fast and furious, while each young fellow followed the Professor's example and drank a toast to the girl of his heart. While all this festivity had been going on at the Grüner Mann, a very different scene had been enacted elsewhere. Young Fritz von Hartmann, with a solemn face and reserved manner, had, after the experiment, consulted and adjusted some mathematical instruments, after which, with a few peremptory words to the janitor, he had walked out into the street and wended his way slowly in the direction of the house of the Professor. As he walked, he saw von Althaus, the Professor of Anatomy, in front of him, and quickening his pace he overtook him. "I say, von Althaus," he exclaimed, tapping him on the sleeve, "you were asking me for some information the other day concerning the middle coat of the cerebral arteries. Now I find—" "Donnerwetter!" shouted von Althaus, who was a peppery old fellow. "What the deuce do you mean by your impertinence? I'll have you up before the Academical Senate for this, sir!" With which threat he turned on his heel and hurried away. Von Hartmann was much surprised at this reception. "It's on the account of this failure of my experiment," he said to himself, and continued moodily on his way. Fresh surprises were in store for him, however. He was hurrying along when he was overtaken by two students. These youths, instead of raising their caps or showing any other sign of respect, gave a wild whoop of delight the instant that they saw him, and rushing at him, seized him by each arm and commenced dragging him along with them. "Gott in Himmel!" roared von Hartmann. "What is the meaning of this unparalleled insult? Where are you taking me?" "To crack a bottle of wine with us," said the two students. "Come along, that is an invitation which you have never refused." "I've never heard of such insolence in my life," cried von Hartmann. "Let go my arms. I shall certainly have you rusticated for this. Let me go, I say." And he kicked furiously at his captors.
"Oh, if you choose to turn ill-tempered, you may go where you like," the student said, releasing him. "We can do very well without you." "I know you. I'll pay you out," said von Hartmann furiously, and continued in the direction which he imagined to be his own home, much incensed at the 2 episodes which had occurred to him on the way. Now, Madame von Baumgarten, who was looking out of the window and wondering why her husband was late for dinner, was considerably astonished to see the young student come stalking down the road. As already remarked, she had a great antipathy to him, and if ever he ventured into the house it was in sufferance and under the protection of the professor. Still more astonished was she, therefore, when she beheld him undo the wicket gate and stride up the garden path with the air of one who is master of the situation. She could hardly believe her eyes, and hastened to the door with all her maternal instincts up in arms. From the upper windows the fair Elisa had also observed this daring move upon the part of her lover, and her heart beat quick with mingled pride and consternation. "Good day, sir," Madame von Baumgarten remarked to the intruder as she stood in gloomy majesty in the open doorway. "A very fine day indeed, Martha," returned the other. "Now don't just stand there like a statue of Juno, but bustle about and get the dinner ready, for I am well nigh starved." "Martha! Dinner!" ejaculated the lady, falling back in astonishment. "Yes, dinner, Martha, dinner," howled von Hartmann, who was becoming irritable. "Is there anything wonderful in that request when a man has been out all day? I'll wait in the dining-room. Anything will do. Schinken and sausage and prunes. Any little thing that happens to be about. There you are, standing staring again. Woman, will you or will you not stir your legs?" This last address, delivered with a perfect shriek of rage, had the effect of sending good Madame von Baumgarten flying along the passage and through the kitchen, where she locked herself up in the scullery and went into violent hysterics. In the meantime, von Hartmann strode into the room and threw himself down upon the sofa in the worst of tempers. "Elisa!" he shouted. "Confound the girl! Elisa!" Thus roughly summoned, the young lady came timidly downstairs and into the presence of her lover. "Dearest," she cried, throwing her arms around him, "I know this is all done for my sake. It is a ruse in order to see me." Von Hartmann's indignation at this fresh attack upon him was so great that he became speechless for a minute from rage, and could only glare and shake his fists while he struggled in her embrace. When he at last regained his utterance, he indulged in such a bellow of passion that the young lady dropped back, petrified with fear, into an armchair. "Never have I passed such a day in my life," von Hartmann cried, stamping upon the floor. "My experiment has failed. Von Althaus has insulted me. 2 students have dragged me along the public road. My wife nearly faints when I ask her for dinner, and my daughter flies at me and hugs me like a grizzly bear." "You are ill, dear," the young lady cried. "Your mind is wandering. You have not even kissed me once." "No, and I don't intend to either," von Hartmann said with decision. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why don't you go and fetch my slippers, and help your mother to dish the dinner?" "And is it for this?" Elisa cried, burying her face in a handkerchief. "Is it for this that I have loved you passionately for upwards of 10 months? Is it for this that I have braved my mother's wrath? Oh, you have broken my heart, I'm sure you have." And she sobbed hysterically. "I can't stand much more of this," roared von Hartmann furiously. "What the deuce does the girl mean? What did I do 10 months ago which inspired you with such a particular affection for me? If you are really so very fond, you would do better to run away down and find the schinken and some bread, instead of talking all this nonsense." "Oh, my darling!" cried the unhappy maiden, throwing herself into the arms of what she imagined to be her lover. "You do but joke in order to frighten your little Elisa." Now it chanced that at the moment of this unexpected embrace, von Hartmann was still leaning back against the end of the sofa, which, like much German furniture, was in a somewhat rickety condition. It also chanced that beneath this end of the sofa there stood a tank full of water, in which the physiologist was conducting certain experiments upon the ova of fish, and which he kept in his drawing-room in order to ensure an equable temperature. The additional weight of the maiden combined with the impetus with which she hurled herself upon him, caused the precarious piece of furniture to give way, and the body of the unfortunate student was hurled backwards into the tank, with which his head and shoulders were firmly wedged, while his lower extremities flapped helplessly about in the air. This was the last straw. Extricating himself with some difficulty from his unpleasant position, von Hartmann gave an inarticulate yell of fury, and dashing out of the room, in spite of the entreaties of Elisa, he seized his hat and rushed off into the town, all dripping and dishevelled, with the intention of seeking in some inn the food and comfort which he could not find at home. As the spirit of von Baumgarten, encased in the body of von Hartmann, strode down the winding pathway which led down to the little town, brooding angrily over his many wrongs, he became aware that an elderly man was approaching him, who appeared to be in an advanced state of intoxication. Von Hartmann waited by the side of the road and watched this individual, who came stumbling along, reeling from one side of the road to the other, and singing a student song in a very husky and drunken voice. At first, his interest was merely excited by the fact of seeing a man of so venerable an appearance in such a disgraceful condition, but as he approached nearer, he became convinced that he knew the other well, though he could not recall when or where he had met him. This impression became so strong with him that when the stranger came abreast of him, he stepped in front of him and took a good look at his features. "Well, sonny," said the drunken man, surveying von Hartmann and swaying about in front of him, "where the henker have I seen you before? I know you as well as I know myself. Who the deuce are you?" "I am Professor von Baumgarten," said the student. "May I ask who you are? I am strangely familiar with your features." "You should never tell lies, young man," said the other. "You are certainly not the professor, for he is an ugly, snuffy old chap, and you are a big, broad-shouldered young fellow. As to myself, I am Fritz von Hartmann at your service." "That you certainly are not," exclaimed the body of von Hartmann. "You might very well be his father, but, hullo, sir, are you aware that you are wearing my studs and my watch-chain?" "Donnerwetter!" hiccuped the other. "If those are not the trousers for which my tailor is about to sue me, I may never taste beer again." Now as von Hartmann, overwhelmed by the many strange things which had occurred to him that day, passed his hand over his forehead and cast his eyes downwards, he chanced to catch the reflection of his own face in a pool which the rain had left upon the road. To his utter astonishment, he perceived that his face was that of a youth, that his dress was that of a fashionable young student, and that in every way he was the antithesis of the grave and scholarly figure in which his mind was wont to dwell. In an instant his active brain ran over the series of events which had occurred, and sprang to the conclusion. He fairly reeled under the blow. "Himmel!" he cried. "I see it all. Our souls are in the wrong bodies. I am you, and you are I. My theory is proved, but at what an expense! Is the most scholarly mind in Europe to go about with this frivolous exterior? Oh, the labours of a lifetime are ruined!" And he smote his breast in despair. "I say," remarked the real von Hartmann from the body of the professor, "I quite see the force of your remarks, but don't go knocking my body about like that. You received it in an excellent condition, but I perceive that you have wet it and bruised it, and spilled snuff over my ruffled shirt-front." "It matters little," the other said moodily. "Such as we are, so must we stay. My theory is triumphantly proved, but the cost is terrible." "If I thought so," said the spirit of the student, "it would be hard indeed. What could I do with these stiff old limbs, and how could I woo Elisa and persuade her that I was not her father? No, thank heaven, in spite of the beer which has upset me more than it ever could upset my real self, I can see a way out of it." "How?" gasped the professor. "Why, by repeating the experiment. Liberate our souls once more, and the chances are that they will find their way back into their respective bodies." No drowning man could clutch more eagerly at a straw than did von Baumgarten's spirit at this suggestion. In feverish haste, he dragged his own frame to the side of the road and threw it into a mesmeric trance. He then extracted the crystal ball from the pocket and managed to bring himself into the same condition. Some students and peasants who chanced to pass during the next hour were much astonished to see the worthy professor of physiology and his favourite student both sitting upon a very muddy bank and both completely insensible. Before the hour was up, quite a crowd had assembled, and they were discussing the advisability of sending for an ambulance to convey the pair to hospital, when the learned savant opened his eyes and gazed vacantly around him. For an instant he seemed to forget how he had come there, but next moment he astonished his audience by waving his skinny arms above his head and crying out in a voice of rapture, "Gott sei gedanket! I am myself again! I feel I am!" Nor was the amazement lessened when the student, springing to his feet, burst into the same cry, and the two performed a sort of pas de joie in the middle of the road. For some time after that, people had some suspicion of the sanity of both the actors in this strange episode. When the professor published his experiences in the Medikalschrift, as he had promised, he was met by an intimation, even from his colleagues, that he would do well to have his mind cared for, and that another such publication would certainly consign him to a madhouse. The student also found by experience that it was wisest to be silent about the matter. When the worthy lecturer returned home that night, he did not receive the cordial welcome which he might have looked for after his strange adventures. On the contrary, he was roundly upbraided by both his female relatives for smelling of drink and tobacco, and also for being absent while a young scapegrace invaded the house and insulted its occupants. It was long before the domestic atmosphere of the lecturer's house resumed its normal quiet, and longer still before the genial face of von Hartmann was seen beneath its roof. Perseverance, however, conquers every obstacle, and the student eventually succeeded in pacifying the enraged ladies and in establishing himself upon the old footing. He has now no longer any cause to fear the enmity of Madame, for he is Hauptmann von Hartmann of the Emperor's own Uhlans, and his loving wife Elisa has already presented him with 2 little Uhlans as a visible sign and token of her affection. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. John Jones's Dollar by Harry Stephen Keller. Originally published in the Black Cat magazine, August 1915. Narrated by Tom Trussel. On the 201st day of the year 3221 A.D., the professor of history at the University of Terra seated himself in front of the visaphone and prepared to deliver the daily lecture to his class, the members of which resided in different portions of the earth. The instrument before which he seated himself was very like a great window sash, on account of the fact that there were 300 or 400 frosted glass squares visible. In a space at the centre, not occupied by any of these glass squares, was a dark oblong area and a ledge holding a piece of chalk. And above the area was a huge brass cylinder. Toward this brass cylinder the professor would soon direct his subsequent remarks. In order to assure himself that it was time to press the button which would notify the members of the class in history to approach their local visaphones, the professor withdrew from his vest pocket a small contrivance which he held to his ear. Upon moving a tiny switch attached to the instrument, a metallic voice, seeming to come from somewhere in space, repeated mechanically, 15 o'clock and 1 minute, 15 o'clock and 1 minute, 15 o'clock and 1 minute. Quickly, the professor replaced the instrument in his vest pocket and pressed a button at the side of the visaphone. As though in answer to the summons,
the frosted squares began, one by one, to show the faces and shoulders of a peculiar type of young men with great bulging foreheads, bald, toothless, and wearing immense horn spectacles. One square, however, still remained empty. On noticing this, a look of irritation passed over the professor's countenance. But, seeing that every other glass square but this one was filled up, he commenced to talk. "I am pleased, gentlemen, to see you all posted at your local visaphones this afternoon. I have prepared my lecture today upon a subject which is, perhaps, of more economic interest than historical. Unlike the previous lectures, my talk will not confine itself to the happenings of a few years, but will gradually embrace the course of 10 centuries, the 10 centuries, in fact, which terminated 300 years before the present date. My lecture will be an exposition of the effects of the John Jones dollar, originally deposited in the dawn of civilization, or to be more precise, in the year of 1921, just 1,300 years ago. This John Jones—" At this point in the professor's lecture, the frosted glass square which hitherto had shown no image now filled up. Sternly he gazed at the head and shoulders that had just appeared. "B262H72476 male, you are late to class again. What excuse have you to offer today?" From the hollow cylinder emanated a shrill voice, while the lips of the picture on the glass square moved in unison with the words. "Professor, you will perceive by consulting our class book that I have recently taken up my residence near the North Pole. For some reason, wireless communication between the Central Energy Station and all points north of 89 degrees was cut off a while ago, on account of which fact I could not appear in the visaphone. Hence—" "Enough, sir," roared the professor. "Always ready with an excuse, B262H72476 male. I shall immediately investigate your tale." From his coat pocket, the professor withdrew an instrument which, although supplied with an earpiece and a mouthpiece, had no wires whatever attached. Raising it to his lips, he spoke. "Hello, Central Energy Station, please." A pause ensued. "Central Energy Station. This is the Professor of History at the University of Terror speaking. One of my students informs me that the North Pole region was out of communication with the visaphone system this morning. Is that statement true? I would—" A voice, apparently from nowhere, spoke into the professor's ear. "Quite true, Professor. A train of our ether waves accidentally fell into parallelism with a train of waves from the Venus substation. By the most peculiar mischance, the two trains happened to be displaced, with reference to each other, one half of a wavelength, with the unfortunate result that the negative points of one coincided with the positive points of maximum amplitude of the other. Hence, the two wave trains nullified each other, and communication ceased for 185 seconds, until the earth had revolved far enough to throw them out of parallelism." "Ah, thank you," replied the professor. He dropped his instrument into his coat pocket, and gazed in the direction of the glass square whose image had so aroused his ire. "I apologize, B262H72476 male, for my suspicions as to your veracity, but I had in mind several former experiences." He shook a warning forefinger. "I will now resume my talk. A moment ago, gentlemen, I mentioned the John Jones dollar. Some of you who have just enrolled with the class will undoubtedly say to yourselves, 'What is a John Jones? What is a dollar?' In the early days, before the present scientific registration of human beings was instituted by the National Eugenic Society, man went around under a crude multi-reduplicative system of nomenclature. Under this system, there was actually more John Joneses than there are calories in a British thermal unit. But there was one John Jones in particular, living in the 20th century, to whom I shall refer in my lecture. Not much is known of his personal life, except that he was an ardent socialist, a bitter enemy, in fact, of the private ownership of wealth. Now, As to the dollar, at this day, when the psycho-erg, a combination of the psyche, the unit of aesthetic satisfaction, and the erg, a unit of mechanical energy, is recognized as a true unit of value, it seems difficult to believe that in the 20th century and for more than 10 centuries thereafter, the dollar, a metallic circular disc, was being passed from hand to hand in exchange for the essentials of life. But nevertheless, such was the case. Man exchanged his mental or physical energy for these dollars. He then re-exchanged the dollars for sustenance, raiment, pleasure, and operations for the removal of the vermiform appendix. A great many individuals, however, deposited their dollars in a stronghold called a bank. These banks invested the dollars in loans and commercial enterprises, with the result that, every time the Earth traversed the solar ecliptic, the banks compelled each borrower to repay, or to acknowledge as due, the original loan, plus 6/100ths of that loan. And to the depositor, the banks paid 3/100ths of the deposited dollars for the use of the discs. This was known as 3%, or bank interest. Now the safety of dollars, when deposited in banks, was not absolutely assured to the depositor. At times the custodians of these dollars were wont to appropriate them and proceed to portions of the earth sparsely inhabited and accessible with difficulty. And at other times, nomadic groups known as the Yeggmen visited the banks, opened the vaults by force, and departed, carrying with them the contents. But to return to our subject, in the year 1921, one of these numerous John Joneses performed an apparently inconsequential action which caused the name of John Jones to go down in history. What did he do? He proceeded to one of these banks, known at that time as the First National Bank of Chicago, and deposited there one of these discs, a silver dollar, to the credit of a certain individual. And this individual to whose credit the dollar was deposited was no other person than the 40th descendant of John Jones, who stipulated in paper, which was placed in the files of the bank, that the descendancy was to take place along the oldest child of each of the generations which would constitute his posterity. The bank accepted the dollar under that understanding, together with another condition imposed by this John Jones, namely, that the interest was to be compounded annually. That meant that at the close of each year, the bank was to credit the account of John Jones's 40th descendant with 3/100ths of the account as it stood at the beginning of the year. History tells us little more concerning this John Jones, only that he died in the year 1931, or 10 years afterward, leaving several children. Now you gentlemen, who are taking mathematics under Professor L127M72421 male of the University of Mars, will remember that where any number such as x, in passing through a progressive cycle of change, grows at the end of that cycle by proportion p, then the value of the original x, after n cycles, becomes x 1 plus p n. Obviously, in this case, x equaled $1, p equaled 3/100ths, and n will depend upon any number of years which we care to consider, following the date of deposit. By a simple calculation, those of you who are today mentally alert can check up the results that I shall set forth in my lecture. At the time that John Jones died, the amount in the First National Bank of Chicago to the credit of John Jones the 40th was as follows. The professor seized the chalk and wrote rapidly upon the oblong space. 10. 1931 years, $1.34. The peculiar sinuous hieroglyphic, he explained, is an ideograph representing the dollar. Well, gentlemen, time went on as time will, until 100 years had passed by. The First National Bank still existed, and the locality, Chicago, had become the largest centre of population upon the earth.
Through the investments which had taken place and the yearly compounding of interest, the status of John Jones's deposit was now as follows. He wrote, 2021, 100 years elapsed, $19.10. In the following century, many minor changes, of course, took place in man's mode of living, but the so-called socialists still agitated widely for the cessation of private ownership of wealth. The First National Bank still accepted dollars for safekeeping, and the John Jones dollars still continued to grow. With about 34 generations yet to come, the account now stood 2121, 200 years elapsed, $364. And by the end of the succeeding 100 years, it had grown to what constituted an appreciable bit of exchange value in those days. Thus, 2221, 300 years, $6,920. Now the century which followed contains an important date. The date I am referring to is the year 2299 AD, or the year in which every human being born upon the globe was registered under a numerical name at the Central Bureau of the National Eugenic Society. In our future lessons, which will treat with that period of detail, I shall ask you to memorize that date. The socialists still agitated fruitlessly, but the First National Bank of Chicago was now the first international bank of the earth. And how great had John Jones's dollar grown? Let us examine the account, both on that important historical date and also at the close of the 400th year since it was deposited. Look, 2299, 378 years, $68,900. 2321, 400 years, $132,000. But, gentlemen, it had not reached the point where it could be termed an unusually large accumulation of wealth, for larger accumulations existed upon the earth. A descendant of a man once known as John D. Rockefeller possessed an accumulation of great size, but which, as a matter of fact, was rapidly dwindling as it passed from generation to generation. So, let us travel ahead another 100 years. During this time, as we learn from our historical and political archives, the socialists began to die out, since they at last realized the utter futility of combating the balance of power. The account, though, now stood 2421, 500 years, $2,520,000. It is hardly necessary for me to make any comment. Those of you who are most astute, and others of you who have flunked my course before and are now taking it the second time, of course know what is coming. During the age in which this John Jones lived, there lived also a man, a so-called scientist called Metchnikoff. We know from a study of our vast collection of Egyptian papyri and Carnegie Library books that this Metchnikoff promulgated the theory that old age, or rather senility, was caused by colon bacillus. This fact was later verified, but while he was correct in the etiology of senility, he was crudely primeval in the therapeutics of it. He proposed, gentlemen, to combat and kill this bacillus by utilizing the fermented lacteal fluid from a now extinct animal called the cow, models of which you can see at any time at the Solaris Museum. A chorus of shrill, piping laughter emanated from the brass cylinder. The professor waited until the merriment had subsided, and then continued. "I beg of you, gentlemen, do not smile. This was merely one of the many similar quaint superstitions existing in that age. But a real scientist, Professor K12B62411 male, again attacked the problem in the 25th century.
Since the cow was now extinct, he could not waste his valuable time experimenting with fermented cow lacteal fluid. He recovered the old V-rays of radium, the rays which you physicists will remember were not deflected by a magnetic field, were really composed of two sets of rays, which he termed the G-rays and the E-rays. These last named rays, only when isolated, completely devitalized all colon bacilli which lay in their path, without in the least affecting the integrity of any interposed organic cells. The great result, as many of you already know, was that the life of man was extended to nearly 200 years. That, I state unequivocally, was a great century for the human race. But I spoke of another happening, one perhaps of more interest than importance. I referred to the bank account of John Jones the 40th. It, gentlemen, had grown to such a prodigious sum that a special bank and board of directors had to be created in order to care for and reinvest it. By scanning the following notation, you will perceive the truth of my statement. 2521, 600 years. $47,900,000. By the year 2621 AD, two events of stupendous importance took place. There is scarcely a man in this class who has not heard of how Professor P222D29333 male accidentally stumbled upon the scientific fact that the effect of gravity is reversed upon any body which vibrates perpendicularly to the plane of the ecliptic with a frequency which is an even multiple of the logarithm of 2 of the Neperian base e. At once, special vibrating cars were constructed which carried mankind to all planets. That discovery of Professor P222D29333 male did nothing less than open up 7 new territories to our inhabitants, namely Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. In the great land rush that ensued, thousands who were previously poor became rich. But, gentlemen, land which so far had been constituted one of the main sources of wealth was shortly to become valuable for individual golf links only, as it is today, on account of another scientific discovery. This second discovery was in reality not a discovery, but the perfection of a chemical process, the principles of which had been known for many centuries. I am alluding to the construction of the vast reducing factories, one upon each planet, to which the bodies of all persons who have died on their respective planets are at once shipped by aerial express. Since this process is used today, all of you understand the methods employed, how each body is reduced by heat to its component constituents, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, calcium, phosphorus, and so forth. How these separated constituents are stored in special reservoirs together with the components from thousands of other corpses. How these elements are then synthetically combined into food tablets for those of us who are yet alive, thus completing an endless chain from the dead to the living. Naturally then, agriculture and stock raising ceased, since the food problem, with which man has coped from time immemorial, was solved. The two direct results were, first, that land lost the inflated values it had possessed when it was necessary for tillage, and second, that men were at last given enough leisure to enter the fields of science and art. And as to the John Jones dollar, which now embraced countless industries and vast territory on the earth, it stood in value. 2621, 700 years, $912 million. In truth, gentlemen, it now constituted the largest private fortune on the terrestrial globe, and in that year, 2621 AD, there were 13 generations yet to come, before John Jones the 40th would arrive. To continue, in the year 2721 AD, an important political battle was concluded in the Solar System Senate and House of Representatives. I am referring to the great controversy as to whether the Earth's moon was a sufficient menace to interplanetary navigation to warrant its removal. The outcome of the wrangle was that the question was decided in the affirmative. Consequently, but I beg your pardon, young men, I occasionally lose sight of the fact that you are not so well informed upon historical matters as myself. Here I am, talking to you about the moon, totally forgetful that as many of you are as puzzled as to my meaning. I advise all of you, who have not yet attended the Solaris Museum on Jupiter, to take a trip there some Sunday afternoon. The interplanetary suburban line runs trains every half hour on that day. You will find there a complete working model of the old satellite of the Earth, which, before it was destroyed, furnished this planet light at night through the crude medium of reflection. On account of this decision as to the inadvisability of allowing the moon to remain where it was, engineers commenced its removal in the year 2721. Piece by piece, it was chipped away and brought to the Earth in interplanetary freight cars. These pieces were then propelled by zoodolite explosive in the direction of the Milky Way with a velocity of 11,217 meters per second. This velocity, of course, gave each departing fragment exactly the amount of kinetic energy it required to enable it to overcome the backward pull of the Earth from here to infinity. I dare say those moon hunks are going yet. At the start of the removal of the moon in 2721 AD, the accumulated wealth of John Jones the 40th stood 2721, 800 years, $17,400,000,000. Of course, with such a colossal sum at their command, the directors of the fund had made extensive investments on Mars and Venus. By the end of the 28th century, or the year 2807 AD, the moon had been completely hacked away and sent piecemeal into space, the job having required 86 years. I give herewith the result of John Jones's dollar, both at the date when the moon was completely removed and also at the close of the 900th year after its deposit. 2807, 886 years, $219 billion. 2821, 900 years, $332 billion. The meaning of those figures, gentlemen, as stated in simple language, was that the John Jones dollar now comprised practically all the wealth on Earth, Mars, and Venus, with the exception of one university site on each planet, which was, of course, school property. And now I will ask you to advance with me to the year 2906 AD. In this year, the directors of the John Jones Fund awoke to the fact that they were in dreadful predicament. According to the agreement under which John Jones deposited his dollar away back in the year 1921, interest was to be compounded annually at 3%. In the year 2900 AD, the 39th generation of John Jones was alive, being represented by a gentleman named J664M42721 male, who was 30 years of age and engaged to be married to a young lady named T246M42652 female. Doubtless, you will ask, what was the predicament in which the directors found themselves? Simply this: a careful appraisement of the wealth on Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, and likewise Earth, together with an accurate calculation of the remaining heat in the Sun and an appraisement of that heat at a very decent valuation per calorie, demonstrated
that the total wealth of the solar system amounted to 6,325,521,362.15. But unfortunately, a simple computation showed that if Mr. J664M42721 male married Miss T246M42652 female, and was blessed by a child by the year 2921, which year marked the 1,000th year since the deposit of the John Jones dollar, then in that year there would be due the child the following amount: 2921, 1,000 years, $6,310,000,000,000. It simply showed beyond all possibility of argument that by 2921 AD we would be $474,758,637.85 shy, that we would be unable to meet the debt to John Jones the 40th. I tell you, gentlemen, the board of directors was frantic. Such wild suggestions were put forth as the sending of an expeditionary force to the nearest star in order to capture some other solar system and thus obtain more territory to make up the deficit. But that project was impossible on account of the number of years that it would have required. Visions of immense lawsuits disturbed the slumber of those unfortunate individuals who formed the John Jones Dollar Directorship. But on the brink of one of the biggest civil actions the courts had ever known, something occurred that altered everything. The professor again withdrew the tiny instrument from his vest pocket, held it to his ear, and adjusted the switch. A metallic voice rasped, 15 o'clock and 52 minutes. 15 o'clock and 52 minutes. He replaced the instrument and went on with his talk. I must hasten to the conclusion of my lecture, gentlemen, as I have an engagement with Professor C122B24999 male of the University of Saturn at 16 o'clock. Now, let me see. I was discussing the big civil action that was hanging over the heads of the John Jones Dollar directors. Well, this Mr. J664M42721 male, the 39th descendant of the original John Jones, had a lover's quarrel with Miss T246M42652 female, which immediately destroyed the probability of their marriage. Neither gave in to the other. Neither ever married. And when Mr. J664M42721 male died in 2946 AD, of a broken heart, as it was claimed, he was single and childless. As a result, there was no one to turn the solar system over to. Immediately, the interplanetary government stepped in and took possession of it. At that instant, of course, private property ceased. In the twinkling of an eye almost, we reached the true socialistic and democratic condition for which man had futilely hoped throughout the ages. That is all today, gentlemen. Class is dismissed. One by one, the faces faded from the visiphone. For a moment, the professor stood ruminating. A wonderful man, that old socialist, John Jones the First, he said softly to himself. A far-seeing man, a bright man, considering that he lived in such a dark era as the 20th century. But how nearly his well-contrived scheme went wrong. Suppose that 40th descendant had been born. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.